language and literature, and I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to share my work with you, and I look forward to the conversation to come. So a bit of introduction. I am a scholar of 20th and 21st century literatures in English with a focus on the novel. My work investigates the afterlives of wartime violence, the cultural, social, and legal formations that emerge after war and violent conflict, such as the creation of Britain's modern welfare state, the focus of my first book, innovations in international law, and practices of transnational adoption. In studying the nexus of warfare and welfare, I'm interested in how war offers an occasion to reimagine what social services the state can offer in relation to, or even as recompense for, wartime violence. And as a literary scholar, I am particularly invested in querying this as if of post-war repair, with all the fictions and fantasies that underwrite it. So in my first book, this has meant examining the literatures of British post-war reconstruction, which sought not only to rebuild the homes of the home front, but all of British society. In my second book, this means turning to emerging practices of transnational and transracial adoption, which were figured as forms of reparation for colonial and military violence during World War II and the global Cold War. And for me, it's also meant studying law as a charged site of repair through the set of jurisprudential innovations in post-war criminal trials, human rights, and truth and reconciliation that developed post-1945. And so I would say, all in all, I hope that my work contributes towards what could be a scholarly praxis, even in ethics, in which we pay attention to forms that precipitate not only from the violence of war, but also from its aftermath. In other words, I advocate for treating post-war periods as complex sites of analysis, sites that are equally complex and in need of as much theorizing and care as war itself. So today I'll be speaking primarily about my first book, States of Repair, The Promise of Welfare, and the post-war British and Anglophone novel. And in a way, this project began as a question about and play with our discipline's periodizing terms for 20th and 21st century literatures, specifically the ubiquitous periodizing term for British and Anglophone literatures, post-war or post-1945. That post-1945 bears a special, even synonymous relationship to another periodizing term, the post-war, suggests that we take a searching look at what exactly constitutes the postness of post-45. So for British literature, one immediate answer is to be found in the mythology of the Blitz, which plays an outsized role in the cultural imagination around the Second World War, continuing to fuel cultural production from feature films to TV series, genre and literary fiction, video games, and documentaries. And its story goes something like this. As the island fortress standing alone against the European Nazi invasion, wartime Britain not only occupied an exceptional position amongst its European neighbors, but also experienced total war, an exceptional form of warfare. Total war meant a collapse or a conflation of the boundaries between combatants and civilians, foreign and domestic affairs, military events, and everyday home front efforts. This experience was made possible by wartime logic and language around the public good, which catalyzed the British population into the militarized machine that would eventually win the war. The Second World War thus became the quote-unquote People's War, one that, as Angus Calder put it, made Britain's people protagonists in their own history in a fashion never known before. Indeed, as propaganda campaigns like the now iconic Keep Calm and Carry On reminded people, their eating habits, travel plans, conversations, even affect were part of an intricate social web whose cause and effect went beyond their immediate scope of vision. In contrast, my book offers a new specific metric of the cultural weight of Britain's Second World War, namely its promise of social reconstruction through the creation of a post-war welfare state. And literary histories I found of Britain's Second World War tend to uniformly consign the post-war to a coda, if they mention it at all, focusing instead on wartime violence and the state's influence over literary and cultural production. Yet peace was certainly part of war culture, with its own form of promotion, conscription, and propaganda. As one of the most salient cultural legacies to emerge from the Second World War, this reconstructive ethos captures what Joe Harris describes as mid-century's, quote, elusive but important change in the perceptions of the mutual relationship between society and the state, end quote. During the war, the state's renewed commitment to social welfare became especially pronounced as the thing worth fighting for, not just for few, but for all. And as such, welfare provisions lost some of their associated stigma and became recentered as a national cause, a wished-for transformation into a more coherent and secure society. So the project of my book is to track the cultural impress left by post-war Reconstruction. How does literary production communicate the value and character of the welfare state? How does it do so differently than the already highly symbolic discourses of post-war Reconstruction? And above all, why does literature keep returning to this transitional moment in order to make sense of the 20th and now 21st century world? So I'm going to address these questions in 4 different ways during my talk today. First, I'll begin by illustrating my approach to the aesthetic ramifications of this transition from warfare to welfare, as I initially encountered them, through a series of period documents showcasing the intimate relationship between spatial construction, that is, rebuilding the blitzed homes of the home front, and social reconstruction, that is, the post-war creation of the British welfare state. As I'll discuss, this social and spatial logic was especially pronounced in the reimagination of domestic space at the time, which provided a series of new art forms and reading practices unique to this mid-century moment. So it's kind of an origin story, is part 1. Second, I'll give you a bird's eye view of the critical work that precipitated from this research, giving you an overview of its 6 constitutive chapters. Third, I'll speak a bit about the project's methods and conclusions, focusing specifically on the importance of the novel and its implications for literary periodization. And finally, I'll turn to Kazuo Ishiguro's 2005 novel, Never Let Me Go, a case study that teaches us how to feel the promise of Britain's post-war imagination, even in the bleakest of settings. Ultimately, I contend that the cultural fascination with 1945 is due to the unfinished transition from warfare to welfare, which was never completed as imagined, and whose extant structures are in decay. Literature keeps returning to 1945 in order to work out the unresolved problems of this moment, both by accessing its ferment of imaginative projections, as well as responding to and critiquing its uneven applications. Part 1, beginnings. So the project began, as many do, in the library. I had gone to the British Library seeking, in the early iteration of my project, evidence of Britain's particular involvement with the legal discourse of post-war reparation, and I wanted to know how, if at all, Britain imagined itself as participating in the work of international law and transitional justice after 1945. However, as I was searching for materials on Britain and reparation, what kept coming up was a key word: reconstruction. Reconstruction. This word clearly captured the British imagination at the time and signaled not only the physical rebuilding of wartime rooms, but also social repair, whereby the reorganization of the very stuff of private life would result in a more equitable, coherent society. Wartime violence became an occasion to build what some called a New Jerusalem, a phrase that marketed the need for social reform. So one of the most familiar and influential textual examples of this move is the 1942 government pamphlet, Social Insurance and Allied Services, or the Beveridge Report, which outlined what we now call the modern British welfare state. It was also, as a side note, a surprise bestseller. It's a quite boring text, but it sold at least 635,000 copies and produced one of the most significant lines of the war outside His Majesty's stationery office. And a poll actually conducted by the British Institute of Public Opinion found that an astonishing 19 out of 20 adults had heard of the report only 2 weeks after its publication, with the majority approving its proposals. So really a landmark text. The document named 3 guiding principles of recommendations undergirding the common sense behind post-war welfare. The first was the idea of revolution, or a desire to be guided as much by visions of the future as experiences of the past. As Beveridge put it in an oft-quoted line, A revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolutions, not for patching. The second principle was that welfare should be comprehensive in its scope, and the report dramatized this by naming 5 giants on the road to Reconstruction: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, corresponding to welfare provisions of Social Security, healthcare, education, housing, and employment. And finally, and most importantly, I think, this concept of Social Security could only be achieved by a new relationship between the state and the individual, one of cooperation and responsibility. Beyond the Beveridge report, however, I discovered a whole wealth of official and non-official wartime publications that participated in imagining the post-war world. I'll introduce you to a few examples here. So the first example is from a special issue of Picture Post, a British periodical from 1941. This magazine, it was again a special issue, roughed out a quote-unquote plan for Britain in terms of social services even a year before the Beveridge report came out. And the magazine throughout clearly sounds a trumpet call for a new Britain. One, as its forward notes, is an essential part of our war aims. And I find that temporality, again, really interesting, that the post-war was being imagined in the crucible of wartime. And here pictured, we have a centerfold depicting a town in Britain, showing its makeover through post-war reorganization. This is a typical, on the left, a typical section under our present haphazard development, and on the right, the same section organized under a coherent plan. Example 2, Planning for Reconstruction, 1943, the third of a series of 3 pamphlets by Architectural Press. This diagram shows the relationship of social services to people in a borough, with each little figure representing 200 people that then are arranged around immediate social services, which are then arranged around larger services. You can see it's kind of this like really interesting abstract fractal, right? And I find interesting here, as opposed to this image, how schematic, diagrammatic, and abstract some of these kind of plans can be as well. And the last example I'm going to share is from the Daily Mail book of Postwar Homes from 1944, which lauded itself as being based on the ideas and opinions of the women of Britain, having given a poll to its readers, with chapters on kitchens, plumbing, windows, and doors. And what I found most interesting from this is this picture plan of this is the house that women want. And it folded out, I don't know if you can tell, but it folded out into this blueprint, showing a sort of stripped open vision of domestic life, and it was highly interactive, unfolding to be much bigger than the book itself. So the post-war Reconstruction offers a dense and even over-determined archive for investigating social change, surprisingly little attention has been paid to its influence on British literary culture. Yet, as you can see, it was a predominantly aesthetic discourse, promoted in magazines, studied in mass observation, diagrammed in pamphlets, displayed in several popular exhibitions, and propagandized in films and posters. Taken together, these documents sought to instill new reading practices and readerly desires, a real will to order the current mess that was the ruins of the home front and even pre-war Britain. These documents ask readers to actively engage with their reconstructive visions, whether it was the before and after time of improvement, the bird's eye view that allows a sense of social totality, hence why I will argue the novel is very important here. Also, there's an invitation to the reader to kind of project themselves into inhabiting these built environments. These documents are also highly invested in domestic space, showing that the battle for the post-war good life was fought as much in the blueprints of the home as on the battlefield. And above all, they show a clear emphasis on the fictionality of it all, the fantasies, wishes, desires fueling these plans, which could only be made a reality if the war was won. Reconstruction thus sought to inspire a collective responsibility to both the war effort and a better Britain, casting wartime precarity as the common ground that would underwrite social transformation in the name of the common good. So, project overview. Discovering the pervasiveness of this discourse in the archive became the impetus for my book's interventions in the narratives and methods of 20th and 21st century literary history. My book argues that we need a new literary history of Britain's Second World War that focuses on the reverberating impact of these wartime visions of rebuilding Britain. If 1945 has become a permanent year zero for 20th century and contemporary fiction, I propose it is due to the heightened awareness of this moment's potential, powerfully concentrated and formalized in the welfare state's political imagination. So this book is organized into two parts, Cradle and Grave, reflecting the British welfare state's promise to care for its citizens from the cradle to the grave. As a structuring principle for the book, my usage of these terms signifies two distinct periods of post-war British literature and its relation to the welfare imagination. Ranging across the different eras of post-war literary production, the works I study are organized around a historical vision that keeps returning to the war and Reconstruction as an organizing logic for the worlds they represent. So part one, Cradle, comprises my first three chapters and covers the first decades of post-war Reconstruction and the establishment of the modern British welfare state. And it roughly corresponds to and covers the period that historians, and even literary historians, call the classic post-war phase of the welfare state, 1945 to 1975. And one of my arguments is that what we think of as post-war literature actually extends far beyond 1975. Chapter 1, A Room of One's Own, Post-War Modernism and the Reconstructive Imagination, begins amidst the ruins of the British home front and frames post-war literature in relation to the belief of many modernists in individual connection as a radical social force. Bloomsbury's ethos to only connect falls flat after 1945, at odds with new ideas of collective justice and living together. Authors such as George Orwell, Graham Greene, and Elizabeth Bowen were unable to write convincing accounts of this post-war society. Instead, they produced novels whose formal failures and ungainly treatment of the working class anticipate the challenges of Reconstruction. In particular, I read Bowen's The Heat of the Day, 1949, as collapsing the relationships afforded by modernist treatments of interpersonal intimacy, a collapse that questions the possibility of connection with regard to its invasive, uncertain time. Yet, I argue this is also where Bowen meets her limit, unable to imagine a concrete social reality without these older models of individual connection. What's left is a deeply troubled novel, one that points to the social tensions of this mid-century discourse of Reconstruction. Chapter 2 knows where safe, angry young women and communal betrayal turns to Muriel Spark, an underappreciated author, whose work offers a counter-literature to the more famous literary group of the 1950s, the Angry Young Men. Instead of their invocation of claustrophobic domesticity and misogyny as proof of welfare's failures, Spark focuses on group dynamics between women. And the chapter focuses on Spark's The Girls of Slender Means, a case study in alternative forms of welfare, one that challenges both the burgeoning mythology of the People's War and the reparative logic of post-war Reconstruction. Set in a girls' wartime hostel, Spark's novel idealizes her lodgers' communal life, only to spectacularly reveal their inherent selfishness and savagery with the theft of a sharp early dress. While the novel positions its readers to find meaning in the ruins of the club, I argue that it eventually repudiates this solace, refusing to transform state violence into an occasion for redemption. Finally, Chapter 3, Unhomely Empire, Seeking Hospitality in Windrush, Britain, closes Part 1 by addressing another challenge to Britain's plans for social welfare, mid-century decolonization movements and mass immigration to the UK. It begins by arguing that the rise of Britain's welfare state cannot be read without its reference to its decline as a global superpower. The chapter turns to Windrush literary production as a testing ground where wartime visions of Reconstruction met post-war social realities. And specifically, it tracks the dream of communal domesticity that saturates the work of Samuel Selden, including the Sunday basement meetings of the Lonely Londoners, the foray into collective homeownership in the housing lark, and the disastrous experience of plain landlord in Moses Ascending. And I then track how this legacy continues to inform contemporary Black British literary production, focusing on Zadie Smith's N.W. Marking the hinge between Part 1 and Part 2 is a short interlude, which I've entitled Failed Utopias, or the Beginning of the End. And this section marks a crucial inflection point in British welfare state history and cultural representations, namely the transition from welfare's classic phase of 1945 to 1975 to its neoliberal restructuring in the late 1970s and beyond. And as an intermediary between Part 1 and Part 2, this interlude describes how the stakes of Britain's post-war shift across this divide both historically and aesthetically. Okay. Part 2, Grave, which includes my last 3 chapters, continues through the end of post-war consensus, the premiership of Margaret Thatcher, and the rise of neoliberal Britain, historical developments that have been seen as marking the beginning of the dismantling of the welfare state. And as 1945 moves from immediate memory to distant history, these contemporary authors thematize this distance within their own work, preserving its transformative potential in narrative form. And with this distance also comes greater geographical experimentation. After a focus on post-Blitz London lodgings in Part 1, Part 2 considers other forms of care and spaces of collective living away from Britain's capital city. Chapter 4, Empty Places, Unproperty, Intimacy, and Queer History, examines Alan Hollingworth's Swimming Pool Library, his first novel, I think one of his best, which encrypts the post-war period as a hidden source of narrative trauma. It reveals the exclusionary power of post-war Reconstruction, whose plans formed around the heterosexual nuclear family and the intensified institutionalized homophobia of the 1950s and 60s. Rather than use the family home as the standard for narrative social security, Hollingworth turns away from property domesticity to embrace mobile practices of queer intimacy. Yet his work still relies on the spatialized welfarist logic of post-war Reconstruction to imagine a better life for queer people, turning to spaces such as gyms, bathrooms, prisons, and colonial outposts that facilitate alternative forms of community and caretaking. Chapter 5, Oasis Societies, Global Welfare and the Romance of Care, or Enchanted Care, considers the historiographic challenge to the visions of post-war Britain that emerged in the 1980s and flourished in the 1990s, the contemporary heritage industry, as well as the related cultural phenomenon of imperial nostalgia. These reactionary discourses vied with post-war Reconstruction's modernizing tendencies, particularly when it came to the family home, by reinvesting in the institution of the country house and romanticizing its forms of sociality. This chapter turns to Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient as a text that stages the battle between the heritage industry and Reconstruction, precisely in the name of post-war repair. While the novel and film outwardly embrace heritage and imperial nostalgic tropes, the novel ultimately undoes them, offering instead an experiment in multicultural living together and the newfound intimacies produced therein. The real romance of The English Patient, and many of you maybe are more familiar with the film, I argue that the real romance is a transnational welfare without the state, based on mutual domestic care. And my last chapter in Part 2 is Institutional Life, Neoliberalism, and Infrastructural Interiority, whereas I have here, sorry, my updated chapter title, Infrastructural Interiority as a Post-War Feeling, treats Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. How many of you have read Never Let Me Go? Yeah, okay, great, just checking. It's not a test. As a counterfactual allegory of post-war Britain and an exercise in contemporary nostalgia. And I'll speak more about this later in my close reading, but this novel challenges the reader to contend not only with the clone's statistical structures of feeling, something that many authors have written about, but also with the ways that institutional space shapes their aggregate individualism, a cold vision of the welfare state's endgame, and the risks of a reconstructive ethos. And finally, the book's coda reflects on the our contemporary moment, a time when discussions of the need for welfare have intensified due to the catastrophic combination of atrophied welfare states, the European refugee crisis, and the British Home Office's introduction of hostile environment policies against illegal migration. Instead of studying representations of housing and quasi-administrative domestic life, this section considers a structure often hidden from view, Britain's immigration removal centers, which are used to hold and then remove those seeking entry to Britain. And I analyzed representations of these structures in the work of Abdul Razak Gurna, Carol Phillips, and Ali Smith, which bring human rights concerns to bear on domestic welfare. So I want to say something now about my methods and conclusions of this project, how I see the book as attempting to reshape literary critical discourse around British and Anglophone 20th and 21st century literatures. And I'll do so by addressing some of the literary historical conclusions from the book and their implications for literary analysis. So as I show throughout my book, one of the defining features of post-war literary production is in its turn to a spatial vocabulary, activated through descriptions and metaphorizations of built space, interior design, room structures, and institutionalized domesticity. And in an earlier iteration of this project, I was thinking of writing a chapter on each of the 5 giants. So a chapter on social security, a chapter on healthcare, a chapter on education. Ended up being too much. I had very wise advisors. But I also think that the domestic space, as I even saw in those archival materials, was such a charged site because it was so intimate, right? It was so personal. So the book focuses in particular on the novel as a genre receptive to this post-war sea change. As a genre historically invested in representing social totality, the novel produces spaces that approximate that of the nation-state. Its form has also long worked out problems of social connection and collectivity, particularly through the genres of domestic fiction, the 19th century problem novel, and modernist revisions of the South after the First World War. From Jane Austen to Virginia Woolf, the British novel offers a history of how homes are built and what social life it can sustain. At mid-century, however, the novel begins to adapt to this historical opportunity in intimate life and the built environment, reconfiguring its traditional interest in private life to explore what it means to inhabit administered forms of personal intimacy. But why these novels? And I think it's really interesting in any project to kind of check yourself and say, why this object selection? Why is that interesting to me? It was important to me that the literature I chose wasn't just an exercise in nostalgia for a heritage Britain, say Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited as kind of the text, right? Or even Alan Hollinghurst's later The Stranger's Child. It was also important to me that the literature wasn't purely cynical or dystopian in its rendering of post-war Britain, say George Orwell's 1984, or J.G. Ballard's High Rise, which again could have been origins of a book that focused on dystopian fiction. And either approach would have been a fine book, a different book, but that wasn't the book I was interested in writing. Instead, the works that I study negotiate between these 2 extreme examples to writing the post-war domestic novel, avoiding both the paranoid dystopian reading of post-war reconstruction and the idealized nostalgia or melancholia for spaces that were lost. So a sort of reparative ethos. The authors I engage thus, sorry, this is kind of a crazy chart that didn't actually, the format didn't direct, anyway. The authors I engage thus create quasi-administrative home spaces, and that's the sort of list on the right-hand side. Apartments, hostels or hotels, libraries, prisons, and hospitals, to reveal the intimate social effects that follow when infrastructures of collective living displace older sites of private life. Following and transforming Britain's reconstructive imagination, these authors bring strangers into situations in which they jostle each other in often uncomfortable ways, under forms of cohabitation, neighborliness, and other types of sharing space and resources. Using these home spaces as proxies for the welfare state, they portray what happens when we are forced to live together in new forms of intimacy and dependency, shared sites of living that produce strong social fabrics for the nation, or at least we're supposed to. What's more, these works propose alternative configurations of British post-war institutions of care, offering living arrangements such as girls' hostels, swimming pool libraries, makeshift sanatoria, and clone boarding schools. Again, while analogous to these post-war structures of welfare, these social constructions rewrite welfare's practices, whether by radically accommodating racial, sexual, and class difference, such as Hollinghurst and Ondaatje, or conversely, by asking what happens when welfare's authoritarianism is extended to its extreme. And that, for me, is Ishiguro. It could have been Orwell, but I think Ishiguro is kind of more centered for this project. And I can return to this slide. I know it's a lot of text. I can return to it in the Q&A. From this brief overview, I think it's clear that Britain's post-war has yet to relinquish its hold on literary and cultural production, and that it's a force that continues to update this mid-century mandate along new and necessary lines. And in doing so, I read the post-war as a category that really troubles literary periodization, refielding the 20th and 21st centuries in the shadow of post-45, something the term itself demands. So this project, I realize with your computers you might not be able to see the bottom line here. The bottom line means modernism, mid-century, post-colonial, and contemporary, which are the four distinct literary periods that are usually discrete categories that this book brings together, knits together under the framework of post-45. And I'll say a few words just about a few of them. Literary modernism, actually, I did not think I was going to be writing in some way about modernism, but I found it to be a really important kind of pre-post-war period to think about, or really its own post-war period, post-World War I. Literary modernism backlights and informs my readings of the changes beset in post-1945 fiction. And to bring this aesthetic shift more fully into view, I employ what I call a comparative post-war framework of analysis, drawing on the conventional association between literary modernism and the First World War to understand the changing stakes of literature after the Second World War. Modernism's relationship to the First World War has often been characterized as a turn to linguistic experiment in response to state failures on the battlefield and in public reason. In comparison to the clumsy, bureaucratic, jingoistic wartime state, modernism offered progressive, even radical political stances and aesthetic forms, particularly in its turn to the individual and literary interiority. The end of the Second World War, however, provoked a different approach, requiring new artistic negotiation with state visions of collective justice. And literary critics have turned to, in thinking about this, new forms of citizenship, post-colonial nationhood, war crimes, and human rights as crucial ways of understanding this interest in mid-century collectivity. And my book adds another term to this list, which would be the welfare state, another institutional formation at the center of mid-century culture, providing a language for its reformulations of belonging, personhood, and rights. The scope of this project also challenges literary periodization that characterizes post-war British literature as a distinct period, one that ends in the 1970s, or even earlier sometimes. This book instead offers a different approach, one that attends to the continued resurfacing of Britain's post-war in every subsequent era. Taking a long view of post-war British literature, it argues that the post-war has played a crucial role in determining what stories can be told about Britain's contemporaneity by British immigrant and Anglophone writers alike. And what emerges, I found, is a global conversation. This arc from British to world literature demonstrates that British welfare state reparation is one of the paradigmatic languages of the post-1945 era. Acting upon even the most venerable of national novel traditions, this ethos of reconstruction modernizes several genres, including the country house novel, the novel of manners, the novel of consciousness, the social problem novel, the colonial adventure novel, and the science fiction novel. So on that note, let's turn to Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. So I'm now going to give you an example of the kind of literary analysis I perform in my book, drawn from my last chapter. And in this chapter, I focus on Ishiguro, an author who I read as perhaps the most deeply, maybe symptomatically committed of all the authors I studied to the question of what it is like to live and rebuild one's life after the Second World War. So in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech entitled My 20th Century Evening and Other Small Breakthroughs, Ishiguro spoke directly about the impression of Britain's post-war period on his own life, he having immigrated to England from Japan, Nagasaki, at the age of 5. And he says, "I'm amazed by the openness and instinctive generosity with which our family was accepted by this ordinary English community. The affection, respect, and curiosity I retain to this day for that generation of Britons who came through the Second World War and built a remarkable new welfare state in its aftermath derive significantly from my personal experiences from those years." As many of you may know, Ishiguro's critically and commercially successful books revolve around highly articulate, self-conscious protagonists who reflect on the remains of their days, a before and after, often structured around wartime and a post-war period. In a structure common to many of his novels, these reflections then culminate in shattering self-realizations in which the characters realize that their very person, indeed their very sense of worth, was predicated on their complicity with larger systems of violence. Now for a while, maybe the best known example of this was his 1989 Remains of the Day. How many of you have read Remains of the Day? Or seen the film? Yeah. Okay. So this Remains of the Day, the protagonist, Stevens, a butler, reflects on what it meant to give his personal and professional best to an employer with Nazi sympathies. Lord Darlington, wonderfully named. But at this time, I think his better-known novel is actually 2005, Never Let Me Go, which develops and explodes the concerns of his otherwise unusually consistent oeuvre. Unlike Ishiguro's other novels, whose events revolve more closely around the time of the Second World War, Never Let Me Go is set much further in the future, in a late 1990s England. It's also written in an experimental science fiction or alternate history genre, presenting a world in which a government cloning program has come to provide a cure for previously incurable diseases. The nationally organized program functions by raising batches of clones and then harvesting their organs one by one until the clones themselves die. So Ishiguro intriguingly and memorably chooses to narrate Never Let Me Go from the perspective of one of these clones, Kathy H. And this is my, annotated copy here. But very sparsely, I usually write more. My name is Kathy H. I'm 31 years old and I've been a carer now for over 11 years. That sounds long enough, I know, but actually they want me to go on for another 8 months until the end of this year. That'll make it almost exactly 12 years. Now I know my being a carer so long isn't necessarily because I think I'm fantastic at what I do. There are some really good carers who have been told to stop after just 2 or 3 years. And I can think of one carer, at least, who went on for all of 14 years, despite being a complete waste of space. So I'm not trying to boast. Compared to his other protagonists, Kathy's narration is a critically limited self-consciousness. It's really interesting. And that makes sense. Clones that pass through the system just don't have the same access to being in the world, not to mention a sense of history that would allow them Ishiguro's typical post-war epiphany. So how, if at all, do we register the post-war condition of Never Let Me Go? One easy answer is given to us towards the end of the novel. The cloning program was a product of England's 1945 consensus politics and a component of the broader post-war program to develop and expand social welfare, a kind of alternative version of the NHS, or National Health Service. This revelation is given to us late in the novel when our protagonist Kathy visits her makers to seek a reprieve from her fate and instead receives a history lesson. Now, while this revelation may satisfy our readerly curiosity as to the provenance of the cloning program, it's also deeply unsatisfying and overly didactic. It also doesn't satisfy Kathy. Remember, she's not a historical being, so being told to try and see it historically doesn't give her any clarification on the meaning of her bleak and imminent fate. Now the more complex answer as to how we register the novel's post-war condition, not through time and history, but rather through institutionalized spaces of private life. And Ishiguro dramatizes this by introducing Hailsham, an experimental project that gives certain clones the chance to grow up in a beautiful boarding school-like environment, rather than the vast government homes that make up the majority of the cloning program. And when I teach this at Harvard University, or I think any university, Hailsham is a lot like college, the space of college in a way, and so the students really connect to this novel. I'm like, but you're actually not clones. Okay. I read Hailsham as standing in for the whole collection of welfare institutions created after the Second World War, founded on an idea of care and the institutionalization of private life. Through Kathy's abiding and ultimately troubling attachment to Hailsham, Never Let Me Go tests the very fantasies that underwrote Britain's post-war reconstruction. As his protagonist struggles to distinguish the self she cultivated at Hailsham from the self that the cloning program would have her be, a question we, the reader, wrestle with as well. Ishiguro reminds us that whether we know it or not, we are all subjects of post-1945. But allow me to get a bit more granular here. For again, the challenge of Never Let Me Go in Ishiguro's oeuvre is that it tests his typical protagonist's ability to see themselves, to feel themselves, as implicated in larger systems, networks, and histories. How then does this protagonist feel the postness of the post-war and its unfulfilled fantasies of post-war reconstruction? Now, one clue comes from the frame narrative of Never Let Me Go, a novel told to us on the road as its protagonist Kathy travels between recovery centers, caring for her fellow ailing clones. Kathy uses this time, heartbreakingly I think, to search for Hailsham, which she never actually finds. Instead, another form of spatial attention shapes her narrative, an attention to the empty highways, fences, gutters, and trash that litter the English landscape, which in turn instigate Kathy's memories of Hailsham. In one typical example, Kathy interrupts her train of thought, saying, but that's not really what I want to talk about just now. What I want to do is to get a few things down about Ruth, about how we met and became friends, about our early days together. Because more and more these days I'll be driving past fields on a long afternoon, or maybe drinking coffee in front of a huge window in a motorless service station, and I'll catch myself thinking about her again. Now, it may seem counterintuitive that these bleak, empty places remind Kathy of Hailsham's cultivated environment. Yet these utilitarian service stations are actually closer to the true nature of being a clone, whose life, after all, is merely the sum of her organs. That Kathy finds Hailsham in these places suggests that Hailsham, too, is a transient, ultimately uninhabitable infrastructure, no better than the program's usual vast government homes. This mode of spatial attention reaches its pitch at the end of the novel, which recasts Ishiguro's trademark self-realization into the unique idiom of never let me go. At this point, Kathy has lost everything: her childhood, her friends, her lover Tommy, her friend Ruth, and she's about to start donating her own organs. Standing in empty fields surrounded by barbed wire, Kathy starts to imagine what she describes as just a little fantasy thing. I was thinking about the rubbish, so this is after Kim, that underline thing. I was thinking about the rubbish, the flapping plastic in the branches, the shoreline of odd stuff caught along the fencing, and I half closed my eyes and imagined that this was the spot where everything I'd ever lost since my childhood had washed up, and I was now standing here in front of it. And if I waited long enough, a tiny figure would appear on the horizon across the field, and gradually get larger until I'd see it was Tommy, and he'd wave, maybe even call. The fantasy never got beyond that. I didn't let it. And though the tears rolled down my face, I wasn't sobbing or out of control. I just waited a bit, then returned back to the car to drive off to wherever it was I was supposed to be. Here we've returned to that bleak setting defined by liminality, detritus, and waste, which then transitions into a beautiful moment of recovery and recuperation. Yet after imagining this world and summoning the lost figure of the dead, Kathy stops herself, able to name the moment for what it is, a fantasy. But Ishiguro goes even one step further, adding that last enigmatic clause to wherever it was I was supposed to be. As Kathy turns back to the car, she leaves the fantastical somewhere of Hailsham for all the wherevers of the cloning program. This qualifier, wherever, signifies a profoundly indefinite space, one emptied of Hailsham's ideological infrastructuralism, where she can finally let herself go. Now, we might conclude that this novel reveals welfare to be an exceptionally violent system, going far as to even train the dead to bury their dead. So what makes this different than 1984, a boot stomping on a face forever? Amazingly, though, even within this world, Ishiguro does not simply repudiate the nation of a state that cares. Instead, he uses his clone protagonist to explore the great and reparative promises made by welfare services and the hold they have even on a character as thoroughly instrumentalized and subject to state violence as the character of Kathy H. And Ishiguro is able to negotiate this seemingly impossible task precisely by reactivating the promises of post-1945 and specifically the spatial hypothesis that the built environment will create a better life for all its inhabitants. So to conclude, Ishiguro's is just one of a large and still growing set of fictions that keep returning to 1945 as a horizon for their contemporary moment. The recursive reinstatement of 1945 models several forms of attachment to a permanent transition away from war, a process that is not just unfinished, but also perhaps unfinishable. Now, this gravitational pull of Reconstruction may seem melancholic, trapping us in a never-ending loop. If, as Adam Piatt has provocatively suggested, The Second World War, quote, spiritually exhausted British culture and transformed it into something approaching a theater of dead mannequins, end quote. This account of the post-war imagination might be equally insidious, a theater of zombie mannequins periodically reanimated by the energy surrounding the transition from warfare to welfare. After all, if you start from the explicitly messianic assurance of a reconstructive New Jerusalem, combined with a history that only delivers poor constructions, even destructions of its vision, what else can you do but keep rewriting its original promise? Yet while the novels described in my book derive their force from disenchantment with forms of institutionalized or collective care, they speak equally, if not more urgently, to the continued desire for welfare as social repair, refusing to surrender to a paranoid vision of the world. Though they acknowledge that we have not achieved the equitable coherence of citizenry imagined by the welfare state, they are not content to stop there. Instead, they reanimate the welfare ethos and rewrite forms of state repair, asking what role state institutions might play in creating a more just society today. As these works are held in both critical and popular regard, my work gives a fresh vantage point on the literary value and canonical vitality of the Second World War. It may be that these works gain such a wide readership today, due in part to their vivid imaginings of post-war repair. In other words, in a new century of perpetual war, these novels return us to the opportunities and transformative energies of post-45. Now, that still may sound like a bad thing, and generally being stuck is. But I'd encourage us today to dwell a bit in this moment, asking how post-45 holds on to us today. While my book is thinking about this question specifically in a British context, I'm also interested in the ways that post-war signifies along other geopolitical lines. What hopes and disappointments are built into various war and post-war divides? How do they shape the way we read and understand the world today? These questions have not lost their urgency, and until they do, we need to keep asking what attachments we have to their promises and how we continue to live in their wake. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rich, for your thought-provoking lecture. I think it's time to get questions from the floor. So
I can go back to any slide you saw as well.
while people are they're thinking about their question, actually, can you share a little bit of your research process? Because I see there are like many students who
Sure.
is actually in their initial or middle stage of their thesis and dissertation writing. So I see that your research is there's like tons of research on not just the literary text but on the historical text. Can you share what were the largest challenges?
Oh yeah, so many challenges. Yes, yeah. Well, I think that one of the reasons, and we were talking a little bit about this at lunch, I just like to go back to this as inspiration. Ta-da! The British Library. I think one of the greatest things that drew me to English literature, the discipline of English literature, is that it's so capacious and it's so open to interdisciplinarity in ways that other disciplines aren't. And maybe that's also a bad thing because we are all, amateurs. I'm not actually a lawyer, but I write on law and literature, and so we all think we can do this. But I also think it's really important to think about literature's openings to things like political history, legal history, social experience, infrastructure, etc. And so the process, it takes time, right? I think that one thing that I've actually really appreciated about my own career is having a sustained interest in another kind of adjacent field or a very specific interdisciplinarity. So I went to a college called Amherst College, and I majored in a major called Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought, and that is where thought was happening at Amherst. It wasn't in the English department, it was in the legal department, because they were doing theory. They were doing theory there, and they were thinking it wasn't just law, it was thinking in an interdisciplinary way. And so I think that you need to listen to the things that excite you, that are also outside English, and say, how can you bring that excitement about other formations, which are eminently discursive, eminently textual, eminently aesthetic, and that's the other beautiful but also omnivorous thing about English literature is that everything is text, right? So there are kind of common grounds that you can think about. But I kept publishing in that field, I kept teaching in that field, and there's ways that carrying that with you has just really helped enrich the way that I read text. So that's like one point of process that I would absolutely recommend. Think outside English as well. Other forms of process, it's hard. I mean, I think the problem or the affordances of writing a dissertation or a master's thesis is that you do get to think capaciously in a way that you don't with a smaller project. So I also think what I tried to get at in this lecture, and I never thought I'd be one of those people that thought about like the organizing principles of our discipline. You know, what is so modern about modernism? Or what is so early about early modern, or whatever, you know? Below, here I am doing that. But I think that there's a way that if you think about the assumptions that our discipline is making about the fields that you're interested in, and you take those terms and you really, I don't know, drill into them or say, how might we reanimate this differently? There's a very fine line between standing around the empty crypt of modernism and also reanimating it, I think. But that is, I think, one place to say, it's very easy as a graduate student, and I still feel this way myself.